actually just got home from attending a Juneteenth festival, and Juneteenth was really interesting to see the celebration and recognition of Juneteenth this year. Generally, I grew up celebrating Juneteenth. So let me start with this. I'm from Washington State. I was born and raised in a very rural white part of Washington State and then moved to the Seattle area later in life. But even in that rural white part of Washington State, we celebrated Juneteenth. It was a huge deal. It was a whole weekend of festivities. It included a parade. It included a pageant that only Black girls got to be in. It included a festival at one of the big parks. Like, it was huge. So I grew up knowing what Juneteenth was and celebrating it in this very distinct way. I was very surprised when I moved to Seattle, which had way more Black people than where I was born and raised. And even when I attended my HBCU during undergraduate, lots of people, Black, white, every color, had never heard of it. So most people who grew up celebrating Juneteenth are often met with the "what's that" when they're celebrating and mentioning Juneteenth. But this year was different. This year, Juneteenth has received a ton of notoriety and a ton of celebration. Now, generally, that's a good thing. I don't think that, I mean, obviously, we want people to become more aware of this rich history. For those who are still not quite clear on what Juneteenth is, let me just provide a quick overview. Juneteenth is a celebration. It's a day that we recognize when enslaved Black people in Galveston, Texas, were finally notified of the Emancipation Proclamation. 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had been announced. So essentially, there was this lag and delay, and I've read a ton of different things on social media explaining why that lag and delay occurred, but we can kind of connect the dots. It wasn't really in the benefit of slave masters to announce that their slaves were free, so they just didn't tell them. That's essentially what happened. And so, but then one general came in on this particular day, June 19th, 1865, and announced to the slaves that they were officially free and technically had been free for the last 2.5 years. So one of the big debates that surrounded Juneteenth this year was whether or not this is a Texans only celebration, or if all Black people throughout the United States, including someone like me, born and raised in Washington State or currently residing in Cincinnati, has a right to really kind of celebrate this. And, I like I said, I grew up celebrating it, and I do think that there is validity to the point that we should not be leaving Texas out of this history. It is not just, oh, this is the ending of slavery. That's not what Juneteenth is. Now, we recognize it as when slavery was ultimately officially abolished, because the theory is that the slaves in Galveston were the last set of slaves to kind of be emancipated. So in that regard, we can say, like, none of us are free until all of us are free kind of ideology. Yes, then we all have something to celebrate, knowing that it was fully implemented in Texas on this day. So that was one of the debates that was really fascinating. Another thing that was particularly fascinating was I started seeing all of these companies and organizations announcing that Juneteenth was going to be a paid holiday. I don't really know how I feel about that, because there's going to be a lot of people getting paid time off who absolutely have no idea what Juneteenth is about. And now they have no incentive to figure it out. So in a weird way, it's kind of becoming like a Martin Luther King Day. It's like a day off for people who don't have any concrete historical context for what this holiday represents and why it's significant and why they have it off. So yeah, I wasn't really a fan of the paid time off. Yeah, that wasn't thought through, and I do think that calls for more conversation about these symbolic efforts of representation without actually doing the readings to see whether or not this is ultimately going to have an impact in the way that they think it's having an impact. So yeah, that one needs to kind of go back to the drawing board, in my opinion. I think that another issue that was really fascinating to me was that there was actually some fun Black church history to Juneteenth that I had never heard before. So I had actually shared this on my Facebook last year, but again, Juneteenth was just last year, Juneteenth was a thing that nobody really knew. But this year I was like, well, let me share it again. Shout out to Facebook memories, because everybody knows what Juneteenth is now. And so a scholar and pastor in Texas, Reverend Dr. Michael W. Waters, shared on his Facebook last year the post that says, "My favorite Juneteenth story is that the slaves initially did not believe the proclamation that they were free. So the slaves made them read the proclamation again on the grounds of the Black church, Reedy Chapel AME Church in Galveston, Texas, to be exact, just so that they could know that it was real." That's so beautiful to me. It's so funny. And again, particularly in this moment where we have all these theories and ideas about the significance of the Black church, or the insignificance of the Black church, you can't deny the role that it has played historically in Black liberation. And if you look at all of our historical monumentous occasions and efforts towards Black liberation, the Black church is implicated in some way. So I just really, I loved reading that, and I had to share it again this year because I thought that was really fascinating. So yeah, I'm curious to hear about your guys' thoughts on Juneteenth. It's definitely been a interesting and wild ride to see how quickly it's unfolded, and how quickly people were to jump on the bandwagon of celebrating it. Again, I think generally the more the merrier, but I also want to make sure that people are doing their research to understand what this holiday is about. I remember seeing a tweet that said something along the lines of, "I can see it now. In a few years, Juneteenth is going to be commodified and commercialized, much like Cinco de Mayo, and they can see some white frat boys wearing dashikis like the one I'm wearing, to go out to the bar, and it's now this celebratory thing across all cultures." Is that necessarily bad? I think this gets into our issue of, appreciation versus appropriation. And so again, until people do that history to really recognize what is celebratory about this day and this history, it probably leans closer to the appropriation side of things. So yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts or share. Yeah, tell me, what are some of the debates and conversations you saw on Twitter and your Facebook about Juneteenth, or conversations that you had with your family about Juneteenth. I'm also curious to hear about, for those like me who grew up celebrating it, how did you celebrate it? I actually posted on my Facebook and asked my friends, how did they celebrate Juneteenth growing up? And I heard some of the coolest cultural practices. One friend shared that they had a bonfire with their family, and they wrote down their burdens throughout that year, and then they burned them at the end of the night. I thought that was so cool. I definitely want to do that one day. Another family, lots of people shared that they attended barbecues and festivals, music, community building. So yeah, it's really interesting to see how Juneteenth has been celebrated, specifically outside of Texas, as people have been growing up celebrating it. So I'm definitely curious to see and hear about how you all have celebrated Juneteenth, for those who grew up celebrating it. So that's all I really have for today. Again, I'm really excited to just have this platform and to chat with you, have these chats with you all, much like this one. I'm also always open to receiving your suggestions about future topics. You can just send those to my email, shayanthethesociologist@gmail.com. Again, to stay up to date on my next video or blog post, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Shayante the Sociologist on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And again, follow me on Twitter, Black Social, with questions that need answered. Thanks, y'all.